These stalks belong to Jerusalem artichokes. As you can see, these stalks are quite dead, and artichokes are a root crop. Jerusalem artichokes, that is, are a root crop, and once you've planted them, you never need to replant them because they'll just keep coming back year after year. So these we planted a few years ago, and they're harvested during the winter. Now, sadly, they're very much a forgotten crop in Britain, or a forgotten food, and I think they're lovely. I love Jerusalem artichokes, particularly when they're roasted. Absolutely gorgeous. But back in the war years, they were grown, not as extensively as a lot of other vegetables, but a lot of people did still grow them. And one of the things that they used the artichokes for was to make something called mock fish pie. And during the war years, lots of mock foods were made. These were sort of foods that looked like the real thing, didn't necessarily taste like it, but as we'll see in a moment, the tubers of Jerusalem artichokes, when you cut them open, looks a bit like whitefish. So there we have a bucket of artichokes. As you can see, that's typical there. The smaller ones are just leaving the ground. They can sprout and be harvested at the end of this year and early next year. So what these will be used for, or some of them will be used for, is to make the mock fish pie, which is actually just a recipe for artichoke gratin. So here we are back in the kitchen, and I've got some of our Jerusalem artichokes here now. So we're going to make a mock fish pie. This pie will not have any sight nor sound of any real fish in it, but the artichokes can do a sort of pass themselves off as looking a bit like white fish, but in fact they're actually just Jerusalem artichoke roots. But the whole point of the mock pies, or any mock foods, is that they were really just meant to look vaguely like what the real thing was meant to look like. And it didn't actually mean that it tasted anything like it. So I think it was more sort of psychological than actual. So I'm going to show you how to make the pie, and the first thing is we're going to boil these up for 10 minutes. There are two ingredients we're going to add to this dish, both of which were very hard to come by during the war years. And one of them is onions, mainly because onions were previously imported from Europe, and obviously with the Nazi occupation of Europe, then getting onions to the British customers became that much more difficult. So most onions in Britain ended up being grown on allotments. So if you had an allotment or a garden where you were growing onions, you were quids in, because onions were in massive short supply and you could trade them for all sorts of things. But also the other thing that was in short supply were fresh eggs. So if you kept a couple of hens in your back garden, then again you had a bit of an advantage. But you'd be very sparing with the way that you used your onions and your eggs. But as I say, in this recipe we're going to add in a couple of hard-boiled eggs. While the artichokes are cooking, we're going to make some white sauce. Now often nowadays when you make a white sauce you would add in cream to it. Well, forget about that for the war years. What we're going to do to make cream is add a bit of flour to milk. In this pandemic lockdown that we're all enduring at the moment, one of the big shortages is flour. We can't get it for love nor money at the moment, so we're being very sparing about it. And now during the war years, flour wasn't rationed, but after the defeat of Nazi Germany, in 1946, there was a big shortage across the world of grain. It was a poor grain crop, plus the Allies were now having to feed the Germans in Western Germany. Obviously the Soviets were responsible for Eastern Germany, and within Eastern Germany was where Germany's main grain producing areas happened to be. So back in Britain, as a result of poor harvest, plus having to support the Germans, we ended up having to introduce rationing of bread within the UK. Heat up the cream, the mock cream, and bring that to the boil. The artichokes have had 10 minutes now, and I've turned off the power, and they're still quite firm, but what I don't want to do is leave them in too long where they just turn to mush. Actually, some of them are softening up. So these are now ready for slicing. So I'll add these to the pie dish, and as you can see, I've already added in the onions and also the hard-boiled eggs. So I've got a few more of these artichokes to slice, but as you can see, they're still in the liquid in which they were boiled, and we're going to use a bit of that in a moment to add to the sauce. So this is the sauce. As you can see, it is quite thick, so we're just going to add in a little bit of the water that we boiled up the sauce, the artichokes, and then we're going to add this to the dish. But you'll also notice I've added a bit of salt and pepper to it as well. There's a lot of salt added to wartime meals because otherwise people would have faced quite a bland taste to what they were eating. So sauces and flavourings were never rationed or restricted during the war, other than restrictions such as the price controls. And people were encouraged to add salt and other flavourings they could get to their food. It may sort of have the experts nowadays, the health experts nowadays, throwing up their hands in horror. But it was a way of adding that little bit of extra flavour to your meal 70, 80 years ago. As I say, nowadays the food experts may well question the quantity of salt that went into meals. One of the other points I was showing before was the use of the water that the vegetables were boiled up in. Now nowadays, whenever people boil up vegetables, they tend to just throw away the water in which they were boiled. Well, don't do that, because you've actually got lots of nutrients in that water. They're being boiled out of the vegetables, so don't waste them. Put them in a pot, add to it over the time, keep it in your fridge, and then you can use that as a stock for making soup, so it's not wasted. Well, the final ingredient to add is just some mashed potato. This was mashed potato left over from last night's dinner, so certainly not going to waste. So we'll just cover the whole of the fish pie, the mock fish pie, with this. Et voila! All ready to go into the oven. You'll need to preheat the oven to 180 degrees centigrade and then put your pie in for about 45 minutes, or at least until the top has nicely browned over. Potatoes were one of the key wartime foods. Grows relatively easily in the UK, and if you had a garden or an allotment, you were encouraged to grow them. If you were a farmer, you were encouraged to grow them as well. If you take a unit of land, you could get far more calories from it by growing potatoes than you would by growing wheat. And we needed the calories, we needed to be able to grow the food that produces those calories, so potatoes were the natural food to grow. Higher quantity of calories per unit of ground space, so it was made sense to grow them in your garden, grow them in the allotment, and for farmers to grow them as well. Well, the pie's had half an hour in the oven, so I'm just going to check it now. So there we go. I actually think that that is now ready. It's browning off on the top, and I can hear it bubbling away underneath. Actually, it's not bad. It doesn't taste at all of fish. It doesn't have any fish in it. But during the war years, what this demonstrates is that if you had a couple of chickens in your back garden, or you had an allotment, or you were growing vegetables in your back garden, then you had that bit extra and didn't have to rely on your rations so much, and you also had the ability just to sort of add that bit extra to what you were eating. And as it was, 1.5 million allotments were growing a huge tonnage of vegetables for the population to eat. And without that, people would have been a lot more hungry in the war years.